1942. Here we are, the wartime era. If there's any piece of media made during World War II that covers the subject of World War II that gets more attention than any other piece of media on the subject matter, it would have to be cartoons. And as World War II was the era for the wartime cartoon, the 1942 Academy Awards for Best Animated Short Subject was specifically the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Subject ceremony for the wartime cartoon. This ceremony, the 11th in total, is widely considered to be the most politicized Academy Award for Best Animated Short Subject ceremony ever. You'll see why in a second. I think you'll already see why when we cover first place. Der Fuhrer's face. When the Führer says we is the master race, we hail, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so we hail, right in the Führer's face. One of the most famous wartime songs of all time, delivered by Spike Jones, and popular enough to get a cartoon centered around it. Donald Duck in Der Fuhrer's Face was supposed to be called Donald Duck in Naziland, but the popularity of Der Fuhrer's Face led the cartoon being renamed to that in its honor. It is satire of life in Germany during World War II, in which Donald has a nightmare in which he is a citizen of that country, being forced to serve the Nazis, or the Nazis as they're called in this case. It consists of poor rationing, extremely impossible work schedules, a lot of tension, and most of the work being incredible shells, knocking up shells and just hailing Hitler at a rapid rate. And it eventually drives Donald to have a freakout, where he thankfully wakes up in America and is glad to be a citizen of the United States. Barring a caricature of Hideki Tojo, there isn't really much that makes it offensive compared to other wartime cartoons. Still, it is brutally effective in its satire, and does make the point of how terrible it was living in Nazi Germany, even if it was a comedy, and even if it was patriotic propaganda in its own right. This was the only time Donald Duck actually won the award, much like how last year's Linda Paul was the only time Mickey Mouse actually won the award. Though also like Mickey Mouse, he was and still will be nominated for several more. The director of this short was a man named Jack Kinney. Though Jack King was the biggest authority on Donald Duck during this time, Jack Kinney was by far a close second. And indeed, both Jack King and Jack Kinney, both Jacks, directed the lion's share of Donald Duck cartoons during this era. Now, Kinney was a Disney mainstay, and his brother Dick also worked alongside him. His highest profile piece of work after the golden age of animation, was directing 104 made-for-TV Popeye cartoons in collaboration with Format Films. The company was called Jack Kinney Productions to hide the fact that Kinney really didn't have a staff. Unlike most of Kinney's Disney output, these 104 Popeye cartoons are considered to be blatantly inferior to not just the theatrical shorts, but also the other TV series material. largely due to the wonky animation, terrible stories, weak gags, yada yada yada. Still, Kinney is a Disney legend, and his and this is proof that he could actually do something good. He could actually make a masterpiece like this on a good day if he had the budget. Now let's get into the runner-ups. Blitz Wolf, a Tex Avery screwball, directed by Tex Avery for MGM. The first of two of his screwballs to make it to the Academy Awards. In fact, his first screwball in general. Remember how I said Tex's career at Warner Brothers won't last long? Well, despite creating Bugs Bunny, Tex Avery felt stifled because Warner Brothers did not have the high budgets he was hoping for, in spite of the budgets actually being pretty high. And then, for his cartoon Heckling Hare, Leon Schlesinger, who usually stayed out of the production process, demanded that the ending of that cartoon be cut. And this wound up ticking off Avery so much that he complained. When he was instead suspended without pay for 4 weeks, Avery just went up and left. Avery's unit was inherited by Bob Clampett, and this is where I want to talk about Bob Clampett. Spoiler alert, Bob Clampett is not going to make it to the Academy Awards at all, but he is considered to be the single most important Looney Tunes director besides Chuck Jones. Beginning his directorial career in 1937, he actually had been on the franchise since 1931 as an animator. Clampett is widely credited to be the man who put the word Looney in Looney Tunes and really shaped the franchise because he was more gag-driven, and like Avery, his mentor, he openly hated Disney. Initially, the bulk of his work was subcontracted to iWorks Studio, but iWorks didn't get very far and Clampett took over the unit, and it was eventually merged within the main Warner Bros. Department. It marked an early example of outsourcing in the theatrical cartoon business long before the 60s made it commonplace. Now, Clampett had the lowest budgets in the studio from 1937 to 1941, but he made up for it by not having an actual distinct style. He basically allowed his animators free rein to draw the drawings in their own style, and the result was animation that looked expressive even with the low budget. Then came a major silver lining in 1941. When Avery left for Warner Brothers, Clampett was given reign of that unit. He pretty much continued what he did in the lowest budget unit, except now he had the highest budget unit and the best animators, and now with free control to do whatever he wanted, and finally free of just producing Porky Pig after Porky Pig cartoon, which was beginning to get to him. He proceeded to produce some of the most zaniest cartoons ever made for the studio from 1942 to 1946. The animators of his shorts during this era, especially Rod Scribner, are widely considered to be fan favorites because they took the rubber hose style to its utmost extreme, and Clampett had a penchant for raunchy humor and subversive gags. He also hated formula. By 1939, just 2 years into the franchise, Clampett was already finding ways to lessen Porky's roles in the Looney Tunes, only bound by the fact that, by a rule during this time saying that Porky had to star in every Looney Tune. Well, now that he was working on Merry Melodies and didn't have to follow this rule, He could direct cartoons featuring Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny. And many of these cartoons, especially his Bugs cartoons, subvert, parody, or deconstruct their respective formulas. He did actually have a few flaws, mainly his ego. He tended to claim credit for things that were not his. He was also massively restless, and his dissatisfaction with the other directors and his desire to do greater things led him to abruptly leaving the studio in 1946. Actually, 1945, but most of the things he directed didn't stop being released until 1946. Oliver Davis took over his unit, but he only lasted 2 years before it was shut down and liquidated due to budget concerns. Clay Abbott would then have a stint at Columbia for Screen Gems, where he stayed for a good 2 years, but didn't really accomplish much. He then went to television, being one of the first directors in cartoons to do so, and then he created Time for Beanie, a very nice puppet show that had a healthy 6-year run. His highest profile project after that was an animated revival, Beanie and Cecil, released solely in 1962, which is widely credited as the first creator-driven TV cartoon because it carried the byline, a Bob Clampett cartoon, and didn't mention any other studio. He did several odd jobs, notably Bugs Bunny Superstar, being interviewed and being the spotlight there, before he died in 1984. He wasn't really well liked amongst his animators, again, because he tended to have a massive ego and he tended to take credit for things that weren't his, like the model sheet for Sniffles, a Chuck Jones creation. Nevertheless, thanks to people like John Kricfalusi and pretty much and especially people like Jerry Beck, Leonard Maltin, and maybe a bit of Ralph Bakshi, his influence and his cartoons have been permanently put in the limelight. But I'm getting off topic. Back to Tex. So where did Tex initially go after he left Warner Brothers? Well, the answer, you see, my friends, is, drum roll please, Paramount, where he created the Speaking with Animals series, a live-action series which featured mouse being edited to be lip-synced to human dialogue. It lasted 7 shorts, but Avery only did the first 3 before he fell out. He then went to, drumroll please, MGM. He was also given the highest budgets of the studios in the studio there, and they were even higher, and he had even less rules to follow. And so he and Hanna-Barbera became the two most prominent, dominant cartoon directors in the MGM cartoon studio, with Avery in particular going on to create some of the best cartoons of all time, a lot of which sadly were not nominated or winning. But Blitzwolf was the first of these cartoons, and it also holds the distinction of being not just his very first cartoon that he did for MGM, but also the very first stereotypical gag-filled wartime cartoon that we are commonly associated with, as it was the very first cartoon that explicitly called out the Nazi regime. It saw the debut of his version of the Three Little Pigs, which wasn't used much, and Wolfie, which was used much. Wolfie was his take on the Big Bad Wolf, and his most recurring character besides Droopy. He is best known, in addition, for his roles in droopy cartoons like Dumbhounded or Northwest Hounded Police for having an attraction to his own sexy take on Little Red Riding Hood, Red Hot Riding Hood. So yeah, Avery is going to reach his peak during his decade or so long, his dozen year or so long stint at MGM. But I'll cover more on that later. Third place, Tulip Shall Grow, directed by George Pal and produced by George Pal as one of his puppet tunes from the Paramount Studio. It is an allegory for the Nazis taking over his homeland of Holland, featuring substitute the Screwballs, which were a very common character in these puppet tunes. Which were very common characters in these puppet tunes. It disrupts a romance between a boy and a girl, and once they are driven out, the romance begins again. Yeah, as you can see, the subject of the Third Reich taking over his homeland was very personal to George Pal, especially since he was forced to flee it as a fully grown adult rather than a boy. A fully grown, successful adult, shall we say, who was already having a nice career. In fourth place, we have Pigs in a Polka, directed by Fritz Freleng with a story by Michael Maltese, featuring animation supervision by Richard Dick Bickenbach. Bickenbach is perhaps better known as a layout artist for MGM, but from 1939 to 1946, he was also an animator for Warner Brothers, further stitching the two together in terms of connections. The two studios together in terms of connections, Warner Brothers and MGM. This is basically the Three Little Pigs filtered through Fantasia, with stereotypical Warner Brothers raunchiness thrown in, and lots of anal retentive timing by Fritz Freleng. Fifth place, we have Jukebox Jamboree, a swing symphony by Walter Lantz, directed by Alex Lovey, with a story by Ben Hardaway and Chuck Couch, featuring animation supervision by Vern Harding. Alright. A mouse wakes up to find that there's a party going on in the Mexican fun place he's at. And notably, the only dialogue in this cartoon is sung by this Carmen Miranda-esque lobster in Spanish, which technically makes this the first foreign language animated short film to make it to these Academy Award ceremonies. In sixth and last place is All Out for V, a Terry tune. Terry tunes. Let's not beat around the bush. The cartoons by Paul Terry, produced by his Terry Toon studio, do not have a good reputation amongst most people. Paul Terry was widely considered to be the top animator in the 20s and 30s. Even Walt Disney looked up to this guy. By this point, however, his flaws became more apparent. Mainly, the fact that he would not get with times. You could not tell a cartoon from the late 30s from a cartoon he did in the mid-50s. That's a shame because Paul Terry actually did have some good things going for him. He was the master of the visual gag. But his cartoons that didn't feature any of his recurring characters usually stunk. Unless they were gag-driven, unless they were allegories like this one. This one was scored by Philip Sheeb, with a story from John Foster, directed by Manny Davis. Philip Sheeb's score did not consist of anything that was not in the public domain, nor does this cartoon or any cartoons that Paul Terry made actually contain advancements that are notable in their own right unless when needed, because Terry was that cheap and he was obsessed to the brim with making sure they were at least profitable. He didn't care what happened as long as the animators met their quota. This also meant that he didn't really supervise how the actual animation went, which actually worked to his benefit, but we'll get to that later. So, barnyard animals wage war against Nazi substitutes that are dropping bombs on them. Simple as that. The only really notable thing to point out is that it's about director Manny Davis. If that last name sounds familiar to you, it's because his brother was none other than Warner Brothers and Columbia Screen Gems mainstay, Arthur Davis. His brother Phil Davis was also an animator, but I'm not sure that he's related to Mark Davis of the Nine Old Men. Some more facts about this ceremony. Pigs in a Polka featured references to the United States at war, and Swing Symphony was actually created specifically because the Third Reich singled out swing as being particularly sinful amongst the Western types of music. Do you notice anything in common? Do you notice what all these cartoons have in common? Yep, they all are anti-Nazi in some way. Whether it's overt, like Dear Fuhrer's Face, or subtle, like Jukebox Jamboree, all these cartoons protested the regime of Adolf Hitler in some way. And since a majority of these animators were Jewish, that kinda made sense. This was the most politically driven Academy Award, in my opinion. Yeah, opposing Nazis is not a bad thing, but you can tell just how much people hated the Nazis just by looking at this. They were bad dudes indeed. And as a few years later will tell you, they're going to be even worse than they imagined. Than they ever imagined and were portrayed here. So, and also, everybody accuses, like the Academy Awards, of having some agenda. But I mean, nobody is going to, of course, nobody's going to complain that they're opposed. Nobody's going to complain that the Nazis were evil. Nobody's going to complain that they're against the Nazis because if you were in your right mind, you would have some common sense to know that the Nazis were evil, of course. But it just has this political air in it that you don't usually see elsewhere in other Academy Awards. With the blatant anti-war bias with the blatant anti-Nazi bias right here. Again, as I'm stating multiple times, so that nobody bans me or cancels me, this isn't a bad thing. The Nazis were evil. But there is a political air in this that is not reciprocated in any other Academy Award, in my opinion. And wow, that's a really bizarre subject matter to talk about during Christmas. The Axis powers? I mean, really? Couldn't you think of anything else better to talk about for Christmas? But anyhow, I guess I've been rambling enough. So, Merry Christmas from the Man from Wackyland. And I just want to notify you that was 1942.